what I want to talk to you for a few minutes about is what does the current situation and the pandemic mean for either what happens with money in the political process and the oversight of that process by institutions such as the Permanent Electoral Authority. So first we should mention the general impact of the current pandemic on everything we do. And we need to realize that the role of money in politics has not become any less important in the current situation, but people are paying less attention to it. And this is the same as for inclusion in the electoral process, or the importance of getting an accurate voter register and so on. What this means is that we need to have increased efforts focusing on political party and campaign finance and other areas to make sure that the political parties, parliament and other stakeholders like the media and the public are aware of the continued importance of these issues, regardless of what is happening with the pandemic. Then I'd like to divide ongoing political party finance from campaign finance. Right? So if we start with the first, the ongoing financing of political parties and the oversight of that. In one sense, the impact of the pandemic is likely to be quite limited. Most countries have a system where political parties are required to submit annual financial reports, and that process remains in place in most countries without changes. The one exception is worth considering is Serbia. They had a legal deadline for annual financial reports being 15th of April. That was postponed when the state of emergency was put in, and it was decided that new deadline would be 30 days after the end of the state of the emergency. Well, the state of emergency was lifted on the 6th of May, which means that the new deadline is the 6th of June. As it happens, that then is only 2 weeks before the newly rescheduled elections in Serbia. So that will be a very interesting challenge. But in general, for most countries in the region, I anticipate fairly limited disruption to the oversight of ongoing party finance and annual reports. This process is normally desk-based anyway, and dare I say it, not seldom fairly superficial. The situation is a bit more complicated in countries where parties are required to submit regular reports on more frequently. Moldova, Ukraine, for example, they report, as I understand, on a quarterly basis. But perhaps more problematic is the reduction in stakeholder engagement. And Septimius already touched on this. In this area, we see how oversight institutions in a number of countries have de facto reduced their engagement with political parties. And that increases the risk of involuntary non-compliance, of mistakes being made. And it also makes it difficult for oversight institutions to ensure that their procedures are in line with the reality that political parties exist in. Then we have the issue of campaign finance. And in one sense, oversight of campaign finance has become easier because of the pandemic, because the elections have been postponed. So no election campaigns and no oversight is needed. This, of course, is a very short-term reprieve. So we still need to focus a lot on both effective oversight and engagement with the regulated community, the parties and the candidates, as well as with media, the public, and with civil society groups. We can safely assume that, at least for this year, maybe the next, any elections that are held will be in a context where the virus hasn't gone away, at least not completely, right? This obviously has implications both for the ability of oversight institutions to monitor campaign activities, and also for the likelihood that potential violations are detected and reported by other institutions or by the public. There are things we can do with online solutions. So Therese mentioned this. I think that should definitely be considered. On the other hand, we also must be careful with rushing into advanced solutions for online systems as a response to a pandemic. We know when such systems have been introduced, it does take a bit of time. It must be tested and done carefully, and it must include consultations with those required to submit the financial reports. So it may be that voluntary measures might be something we would want to look at for the elections within the next number of months, rather than a compulsory system of reporting that parties may not be able to engage with. Of course, we must also acknowledge that the type of campaigning will alter because of the pandemic. We are likely to see significantly fewer mass events with large gatherings of people, and more use of advertising. And this will especially feed into the trend of increasing online advertising that has been happening for the last few years anyway. And again, to some extent, there are advantages here. Spending at rallies, especially spending at door-to-door campaigning, is very difficult to monitor. It's comparatively easier to monitor spending on advertising, especially broadcast advertising, especially if the oversight institution can require information from different media outlets, and not only from those who have been paying. But of course, there are also challenges. And in one extent, most of these are not directly pandemic related. They're just made worse by the current situation. We know that monitoring spending on online advertising is notoriously difficult, especially in relation to multinational social media companies that we struggle to regulate through national legislation. There have been some advances in this field. We do see more companies opening up, providing information about political advertising that they have agreed and been paid for to put on their platforms. So things are a bit better than they were last year, but an awful lot of work still needs to be done. And IFES is continuing to support engagement between political finance oversight bodies and other public institutions and social media companies in a European context and elsewhere to increase the opportunities for effective control and transparency. Lastly, I just want to say a few words about something that Katie just mentioned, abuse of state resources. This is an area which, of course, blurs the line between political finance and other areas like anti-corruption generally, good governance, and the fairness of the electoral process. There is obviously a significant risk that governments will use pandemics to further their political interests and their position. We have seen this in a number of countries. From a political finance perspective, it is essential that the institutions in charge of overseeing provisions against abuse of state resources carefully monitor the situation and act in cases of violations. But that's easy to say. We must also acknowledge that there are many forms of abuses undertaken by those in power that may not be against the strict letter of the law. In some cases, that may be an argument in favor of legal reform, but there are also limits to how far we can come with legislation in this field. I cannot stress enough the importance of a dialogue within us as citizens, among us as citizens, about what we consider appropriate behavior by political actors in a democratic society. I'll stop there. I'm happy to discuss any and all of these issues and to listen to the other commentators.